August 8th, 1945, 3:47 p.m., 12 miles southeast of Osaka, Japan. Lieutenant Marcus Elmo McDilda felt the Merlin engine of his P-51 Mustang cough once, twice, then cease completely as black smoke poured from the cowling. The smell hit him immediately through the oxygen mask, acrid and burning, motor oil mixing with superheated metal and hydraulic fluid. His altimeter needle was spinning counterclockwise through 8,000 feet. Below him stretched endless rice paddies, their geometric precision interrupted by scattered villages where wooden roofs huddled together like frightened animals. The stick went slack in his hands. No hydraulics, no control. The Mustang's nose dropped toward the earth, and Marcus knew with absolute clarity that the next 60 seconds would determine whether he lived or died. His right hand found the canopy release. The wind screamed as the plexiglass tore away. He pulled the harness release with his left hand, felt the straps go slack, and kicked himself free of the dying aircraft. The prop blast hit him like a freight train. Then silence. Falling. The parachute deployed with a crack that rattled his spine, and suddenly he was drifting, watching his P-51 cartwheel into a hillside 2 miles away, where it exploded in an orange fireball that sent black smoke curling into the summer sky. If you want to hear how Marcus survived what came next, hit that subscribe button now. 2 days earlier, the city of Hiroshima had ceased to exist in a flash of light and heat that no one fully understood. The word atomic meant nothing to most American fighter pilots, including Marcus McDilda. He was 24 years old, from Dunedin, Florida, assigned to the 46th Fighter Squadron of the 21st Fighter Group. His war was simpler than physics. Find Japanese aircraft, shoot them down, strafe enemy positions, return to base. Repeat until someone wins or you die trying. On August 6, 1945, something had happened that changed everything. But the men flying combat missions over Japan didn't know what. They knew a single B-29 had dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima and the entire city had disappeared. Reconnaissance photos showed a burn scar 4 miles across where 70,000 buildings had been. The briefing officers couldn't explain it. Some pilots thought it was propaganda. Others whispered about secret weapons. Marcus McDilda didn't care. He had a job to do, and on August 8th, that job was a strafing run against Osaka's industrial district, targeting the rail yards that fed the Japanese war machine. Osaka was Japan's second city, a sprawling industrial complex built on rivers and canals, home to over 2 million civilians and unknown thousands of military personnel. American intelligence estimated that Osaka's factories produced 30% of Japan's remaining war material. Destroying those factories meant shortening the war, and shortening the war meant American soldiers wouldn't have to invade Japan's home islands in an operation projected to cost 1 million Allied casualties. Marcus had taken off that morning from Iwo Jima, where the 21st Fighter Group operated from airfields built with the blood of Marines who died taking that volcanic nightmare of an island 5 months earlier. The flight to Japan was 3 hours in good weather, skimming over the Pacific at wave-top level to avoid radar detection, then climbing to attack altitude as the Japanese coast appeared through the haze. The mission briefing had been standard. 8 P-51s, armed with 650 caliber machine guns each and carrying auxiliary fuel tanks to extend their range. Hit the rail yards. Destroy rolling stock. Kill anything that moves. Get out before the Japanese fighters arrive. Simple. Direct. Suicidal if you made mistakes. Marcus had made 17 previous missions over Japan without catching more than a few holes from ground fire. He was good at this, fast and aggressive. The kind of pilot who pushed the limits and survived because he understood exactly where those limits were. But limits have a way of finding you when you least expect them. The strafing run had gone perfectly. Marcus's gun camera footage would later show 15 freight cars burning, a locomotive blown off its tracks, and at least 3 fuel storage tanks erupting in flames that would burn for 2 days. He'd pulled up from the attack at 400 feet, heading for the coast at full throttle, when anti-aircraft fire found him. The Japanese gunners weren't aiming where he was. They were aiming where he would be, and the 75mm shell that destroyed his engine proved they'd calculated correctly. Now Marcus was hanging beneath a silk parachute, drifting toward enemy territory with absolutely no illusions about what awaited him. American pilots had heard the stories. Japanese civilians hated them with a passion that transcended military logic. The firebombing campaign had killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, burning Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities with incendiary bombs that created firestorms visible from 100 miles away. Every Japanese city bore scars from American bombs. Every Japanese family had lost someone to American weapons. An American pilot descending into a Japanese village wasn't a prisoner of war awaiting military custody. He was a target for revenge, and that revenge would be personal, brutal, and immediate. Marcus could see them gathering below as he descended, tiny figures emerging from buildings, running across rice paddies, converging on the spot where simple physics would bring him to Earth. He counted perhaps 50 at first, then 100. Then he stopped counting because the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was survival, and survival meant thinking faster than the people who wanted him dead. His sidearm was a Colt 1911 pistol with 2 magazines, 15 rounds total, enough to make them angry, not enough to save him. He left it holstered. His survival kit contained a map, compass, emergency rations, water purification tablets, and a phrase card with phonetic Japanese that was supposed to help him communicate. The phrases were things like, "I am an American, and please take me to a military facility," as if Japanese civilians who'd lost family members to firebombing would care about proper prisoner handling procedures. Marcus hit the ground hard in a rice paddy, muddy water splashing up around him as his boots sank into 6 inches of muck. He released the parachute harness and struggled to his feet, wiping mud from his face with one hand while reaching for his pistol with the other. The crowd was closer now, maybe 200 yards away, close enough that he could see individual faces. Men, women, some teenagers, all carrying improvised weapons. Bamboo spears, the kind that Japanese civil defense had been distributing for months in preparation for the anticipated American invasion. Farming tools, sickles and hoes and wooden mallets. A few carried torches even though it was still daylight, because apparently they wanted him to see them coming. The sound reached him before they did. Screaming, not words, just raw hate vocalized into noise that crossed language barriers, because some emotions don't need translation. They wanted blood, and Marcus was bleeding slightly from where he'd hit his head on the canopy during ejection. That blood was going to cost him everything if he didn't move. He ran. Not toward them, which would be suicide, and not directly away, which would just tire him out before they caught him. He angled toward a tree line 50 yards to his left, splashing through the rice paddy, his flight boots designed for cockpits, not for running through flooded farmland. Behind him, the screaming intensified. They'd seen him run. The chase was on. Marcus made it maybe 30 yards before the first thrown object hit him in the back, a rock the size of a fist that knocked the wind from his lungs and nearly dropped him face first into the muddy water. He kept running. Another rock hit his left shoulder. Another glanced off his helmet, which he'd somehow managed to keep on during the ejection. The tree line seemed impossibly far away, receding as he ran toward it like something from a nightmare, where your legs won't move fast enough and the monsters are always right behind you. Except these weren't monsters. They were farmers and factory workers and housewives who'd watched their cities burn, who'd lost children and parents and neighbors to American bombs, and who now had one of the bombers within reach. They caught him at the tree line. The first to arrive was a man in his 50s, lean and weathered, carrying a bamboo spear that he thrust at Marcus's chest with surprising skill. Marcus dodged left, and 3 more villagers tackled him from behind. He went down hard, the weight of multiple bodies driving him into the dirt. Hands grabbed his arms, his legs, his hair. Someone kicked him in the ribs, and he felt something crack. The bamboo spear came down again, this time catching him in the thigh, the sharpened point penetrating maybe half an inch before the shaft broke. The pain was immediate and clarifying. They weren't just going to kill him. They were going to make it slow. Marcus tried to speak, tried to remember the phonetic Japanese from his survival card, but someone hit him in the mouth and he tasted blood. His own blood now, mixing with the mud and sweat and terror. They stripped off his flight jacket, taking the pistol he'd never drawn, taking the survival kit, taking his watch and his wedding ring, and even his dog tags. Someone spat in his face. Someone else kicked him in the head, and for a moment everything went dark. When his vision cleared, he was being hauled to his feet by at least 6 men, His arms twisted behind his back so violently that his shoulders screamed. The crowd had grown, 300 people, maybe more, surrounding him in a tight circle. Most were shouting, but a few stood silent, staring at him with expressions that somehow frightened him more than the noise. Cold hate. The kind of hate that calculates. The kind that enjoys what comes next. They marched him through the village, and Marcus understood this was a parade. They wanted everyone to see the captured American. Children threw mud and stones. Women screamed curses he didn't need to understand. Old men watched from doorways with faces like carved stone. This village had lost people, Marcus realized. Maybe in the firebombing of Osaka. Maybe relatives serving in the military. Maybe just neighbors and friends killed by the war that American industry had brought to Japan's doorstep with overwhelming force. Every window showed him families destroyed. Every face showed him the cost of strategic bombing, the price of total war, the human arithmetic of burning cities to save American lives. He was guilty by association, guilty by uniform, guilty by the national flag sewn onto his flight suit. Justice here wouldn't involve courts or trials. It would involve bamboo spears and torches and 300 people who wanted him to suffer the way they'd suffered. They brought him to what looked like the village center, an open area where dirt roads intersected near a wooden building that might have been a community hall or temple. Someone produced rope, and they bound his hands behind his back, then tied him to a wooden post that had clearly been erected for exactly this purpose. The post was stained dark at the base, and Marcus didn't let himself think about what might have made those stains. The crowd formed a semicircle in front of him, leaving maybe 10 feet of space. The shouting had died down now, replaced by an expectant silence that was infinitely worse. Someone was going to make a decision, Marcus realized. Someone was going to decide how he died, and that someone would be arriving soon. He used the silence to think. His training covered evasion and escape, but nothing about mob justice. His survival cards assumed military capture, assumed the Geneva Conventions might offer some protection, assumed rational actors following some version of international law. This was none of those things. This was pure emotion, pure revenge, the kind of justice that humans dispensed long before laws existed and would probably dispense long after laws failed. He had one asset remaining, his mind, and he had one hope, that someone in this crowd spoke English, or that military authorities would arrive before the civilians killed him. The military authorities arrived 20 minutes later. Marcus heard the vehicle before he saw it, an engine sound distinct from civilian transportation, and the crowd parted to allow a Japanese army truck to stop in the village center. 4 soldiers climbed out, their uniforms identifying them as Kempeitai, the Japanese military police whose reputation for brutality exceeded even the regular army. For a moment, Marcus felt relief. Military custody meant prisoner of war status, meant Geneva Conventions, meant survival. Then he saw their faces, and the relief died. The Kempeitai sergeant had approached him with an expression that suggested he'd rather let the villagers finish what they'd started. He spoke to the crowd in Japanese, and whatever he said caused angry murmurs. Money changed hands. Marcus realized with sick horror that they were negotiating. The sergeant wanted to take the prisoner for interrogation. The villagers wanted to kill him now. The compromise involved payment. Japanese currency passed from the sergeant to what Marcus assumed was the village headman, compensation for giving up their prize. The Kempeitai cut him free from the post but left his hands bound. They loaded him into the back of the truck like cargo, 2 soldiers climbing in to guard him while the other 2 took the cab. As the truck pulled away, Marcus looked back and saw 300 faces watching him go. Some looked disappointed. A few looked satisfied. Most just looked tired, worn down by a war that had already lasted too long and cost too much. The drive to Osaka took 40 minutes over rough roads. The guards didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge him except to kick him when the truck hit a pothole and he fell against one of them. His ribs hurt where he'd been kicked in the village. His thigh bled slowly where the bamboo spear had penetrated. His head throbbed from multiple impacts, but he was alive, and alive meant possibilities. The Kempeitai headquarters in Osaka was a concrete building in the industrial district, scarred by bomb damage but still functional. They dragged Marcus inside, down a corridor lit by bare bulbs, into a room that contained one chair, one table, and instruments whose purpose he didn't want to contemplate. They sat him in the chair. They didn't tie him down, which surprised him until he realized they wanted him to know he could leave if he cooperated. Psychological manipulation, the kind that worked better than physical restraint because it offered hope. The interrogator who entered was a lieutenant, young and educated, speaking English with a British accent that suggested schooling in a colonial territory. He sat across the table from Marcus and smiled, and that smile was more frightening than any weapon. "Lieutenant McDilda," he said, pronouncing the name perfectly. "Welcome to Osaka. I apologize for the civilian reception. They are emotional about the bombings. You understand." Marcus said nothing. Name, rank, serial number. That's all the Geneva Conventions required. "You were shot down over our rail yards," the lieutenant continued. "An unfortunate end to what I'm told was an effective strafing run. 15 freight cars destroyed, a locomotive disabled. Quite impressive for a single aircraft. Your superiors will commend you, assuming you survive to receive commendation." Still Marcus remained silent. The lieutenant's smile faded. "I'm going to ask you questions, Lieutenant. You're going to answer them. If you answer truthfully, this conversation remains civilized. If you refuse to answer, or if you lie, my men will make you answer. And their methods are not civilized. Do you understand?" Marcus understood. He understood that he was about to be tortured, that the Geneva Conventions meant nothing to men who'd watched their city burn, that survival depended on giving them something without giving them everything. "Name, rank, serial number," Marcus said. "That's all I'm required to provide under international law." The lieutenant laughed, a sound without humor. "International law, how quaint. Tell me, Lieutenant, does international law permit the firebombing of civilian cities? Does it permit the burning of women and children in their homes? Does it permit the weapon you used on Hiroshima 2 days ago?" And there it was, the reason they'd brought him to Osaka instead of letting the villagers kill him. Hiroshima, the atomic bomb. They thought he knew something. "I don't know anything about Hiroshima," Marcus said truthfully. "I'm a fighter pilot. I strafe targets. I don't know about strategic weapons." The lieutenant stood up, walked around the table, and hit Marcus across the face with his open hand. Not hard enough to cause real damage, just hard enough to establish that violence was an option. 2 days ago, the lieutenant said quietly, a single American aircraft destroyed an entire city, 70,000 people dead in an instant, maybe more. We don't know the final count because there's nothing left to count. One bomb, Lieutenant. One bomb that does the work of 1,000 bombing raids. And you expect me to believe you know nothing about this? Marcus's mind raced. They wanted information about the atomic bomb. He had no information to give. But if he admitted complete ignorance, they'd have no reason to keep him alive. The torture would continue until they believed him or killed him, whichever came first. He needed to give them something believable enough to buy time but false enough that it wouldn't help the Japanese war effort, something that made him valuable. "I know a little," Marcus said carefully. "Just rumors, things pilots talk about, nothing official." The lieutenant leaned close. "Tell me these rumors, Lieutenant. Tell me everything you've heard, and perhaps you'll leave this room with all your fingers intact." What followed was the most important performance of Marcus McDilda's life. He remembered high school chemistry, half-understood lessons about atoms and electrons, terms that sounded scientific without meaning anything specific. He remembered college physics, the professor who'd explained electricity using terms Marcus only vaguely grasped. He took those fragments, those pieces of remembered education, and he built a lie that would save his life and possibly alter the course of the war. "The atomic bomb," Marcus began, speaking slowly as if reluctant to reveal classified information, "works by splitting atoms. When atoms split, they release pluses and minuses, positive and negative charges. You understand electricity?" The lieutenant nodded. His education clearly included physics. "The Americans," Marcus continued, "have figured out how to separate these charges. They put them in a huge container, millions of pluses on one side, millions of minuses on the other, separated by a lead shield. When the bomb is dropped from an aircraft, a timer melts the lead shield. The pluses and minuses come together instantly. He paused, watching the lieutenant's face. The man was listening intently, trying to reconcile this explanation with whatever scientific knowledge he possessed. When the charges combine, Marcus said, they create a tremendous bolt of lightning, so powerful it pushes all the atmosphere away from a city, creates a vacuum. Then when the atmosphere rushes back in, it causes a thunderclap that levels everything beneath it. Buildings, people, everything. The silence that followed felt like falling. The lieutenant was processing, trying to determine if this explanation made sense. It didn't, not really. It confused electromagnetic effects with nuclear fission, mixed terminology from different fields of physics, and suggested a mechanism that anyone with real scientific training would recognize as impossible. But it was close enough to real science to sound plausible. It used terms that existed. It described effects that matched witness reports from Hiroshima. And most importantly, it came from an American pilot who supposedly had insider knowledge. How many? The lieutenant asked quietly. How many of these bombs does America possess? This was the critical question, the one that would determine whether Marcus lived or died. If he said one or two, suggesting Hiroshima was a unique event, they might consider the threat manageable. If he said too many, they might not believe him. He needed a number large enough to terrify them, but believable enough to accept. 100, Marcus said, maybe more. They've been manufacturing them for months. Hiroshima was just the first. The lieutenant's face went pale. 100 atomic bombs. Are you certain? That's what I heard, Marcus said, maintaining the fiction that this was rumor rather than invention. And the targets? Which cities are next? Marcus knew the names of exactly 2 Japanese cities besides Osaka. He'd seen them on briefing maps, heard them mentioned in mission planning. Tokyo, the capital, and Kyoto, the ancient imperial center. Tokyo and Kyoto, he said without hesitation. They're going to destroy both cities within the next few days, maybe a week. The lieutenant stood abruptly, walked to the door, and called for his superior. What followed was a rapid conversation in Japanese, too fast for Marcus to follow even if he'd spoken the language. He caught one word repeated multiple times. Hyaku. He didn't know what it meant, but the tone suggested alarm. A colonel entered the room, older and harder than the lieutenant, his uniform decorated with medals that suggested extensive combat experience. He stared at Marcus with eyes that had seen too much war, and he asked questions in halting English that the lieutenant translated when necessary. Marcus repeated his fabricated explanation, adding details as they occurred to him, building the lie layer by layer until it felt almost real. The atomic bomb required a special bomber. The B-29 stripped down for speed with only the most experienced crews. The manufacturing facilities were in Tennessee, hidden in underground complexes, guarded by entire divisions of troops. The targeting decisions came from Washington directly, from President Truman himself, because the weapon was too powerful to trust to field commanders. With each detail, Marcus watched the Japanese officers' faces, and with each detail he saw belief growing. They wanted to believe him because the alternative was worse. If he was lying, they had no intelligence on this devastating new weapon. If he was telling the truth, they had actionable intelligence that might save Japanese cities and Japanese lives. Belief offered hope, and after 3 years of losing the war, hope was a precious commodity. The colonel made a decision. Marcus could see it in the man's posture, the sudden straightening of his spine, the set of his jaw. "You are valuable," the colonel said through the lieutenant's translation. "You will be taken to Tokyo. Higher authorities will want to speak with you. If you have told us truth, you will be treated well. If you have lied," he didn't finish the sentence. The threat was clear. They loaded Marcus onto a military transport aircraft that night, a twin-engine bomber converted for cargo. The flight to Tokyo took 3 hours, flying low over darkened countryside where Japanese civilians slept unaware that an American prisoner was carrying information that would reach the highest levels of their government within hours. Marcus spent the flight replaying his interrogation, wondering if they'd believed him, wondering what would happen when someone with real scientific knowledge questioned his explanation. A City College of New York graduate, the files would later reveal. a civilian physicist who'd studied nuclear theory before the war and who would see through Marcus's fabrication in approximately 5 minutes of questioning. But those 5 minutes hadn't happened yet, and until they did, Marcus was valuable. Valuable meant alive. The Tokyo Kempeitai headquarters made the Osaka facility look welcoming. This was where serious interrogations happened, where prisoners disappeared into cells and emerged broken or didn't emerge at all. They put Marcus in a holding cell, 6 feet by 8 feet, concrete walls and floor, a bucket in the corner for sanitation, no windows. The door was solid steel with a slot for food that hadn't opened since they'd locked him inside. He had no idea what time it was, whether it was day or night, how long he'd been there. Hours, certainly. Maybe a full day. Time became meaningless in the darkness, in the isolation, in the silence broken only by occasional screams from other cells that told him he wasn't alone in this nightmare. When they came for him, it was without warning. The door opened, light flooded in, and 2 guards hauled him out and down corridors that seemed designed to disorient. Left turn, right turn, stairs down, stairs up, through doors that clanged shut behind them like the gates of hell closing. They brought him to an office cleaner than the interrogation rooms, with windows that showed daylight and bookshelves that suggested civilization. The man behind the desk wore civilian clothes, a Western-style suit that had seen better days, and eyeglasses that reflected the overhead light as he studied the papers before him. He looked up as Marcus was pushed into a chair, and his first words confirmed Marcus's fears. "Lieutenant McDilda," he said in flawless English, with a New York accent, "I've read the transcript of your Osaka interrogation. I have some questions about your description of the atomic bomb's operating principles." This was it, the moment of truth. Marcus had survived the mob, survived the Kempeitai, survived transport to Tokyo. Now he would either survive this civilian physicist's questions or die when they realized he'd lied. "I told them what I know," Marcus said carefully. "I'm not a scientist, I'm a pilot." "Indeed," the physicist said, "a pilot who somehow knows that atomic weapons work by separating positive and negative charges, then allowing them to recombine to create a thunderclap effect." "Tell me, Lieutenant, where did you study nuclear physics?" "I didn't," Marcus admitted. "I studied some chemistry in high school, physics in college, basic stuff." The physicist removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed designed to let silence stretch into uncomfortable territory. When he put the glasses back on, his expression had changed from curiosity to disappointment. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "I graduated from the City College of New York with a degree in theoretical physics. I know what nuclear fission is. I understand the principles of uranium enrichment, chain reactions, critical mass. Your explanation of the atomic bomb is creative, but it has nothing to do with actual nuclear science." Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. The lie had failed. "I asked your interrogators why you lied," the physicist continued. "They said you insisted you knew nothing about the bomb, but when threatened with execution, you suddenly remembered all these details. So I'm going to ask you directly. Did you fabricate this entire story to save your own life?" "Yes," Marcus said. There was no point in continued deception. "I don't know anything about atomic bombs. I'm a fighter pilot. I strafe targets and shoot down enemy aircraft." Everything I told them was a lie. The physicist smiled, and Marcus couldn't interpret whether that smile was sympathetic or sardonic. "An understandable lie, Lieutenant, perhaps even an admirable one. You told your captors what they wanted to hear to avoid torture and execution. I cannot fault the survival instinct." He stood up, walked to the window, looked out over Tokyo's scarred landscape where American bombs had already killed hundreds of thousands. "The problem," he said without turning around, "is that your lie has been reported to the Supreme War Council. Your fabricated information about 100 atomic bombs targeting Tokyo and Kyoto has been included in intelligence briefings at the highest levels of government. Your fantasy about how the weapon works has been circulated among our scientific advisory committees." He turned back to face Marcus. "Do you understand what this means, Lieutenant? You have injected false information into the Japanese government's decision-making process at the most critical moment of the war. You have potentially altered strategic calculations that affect millions of lives." Marcus felt ice in his stomach. "I just wanted to live," he said quietly. "I just wanted them to not kill me." "I know," the physicist said, "and ironically, your lie may achieve something your truth never could." The Supreme War Council meets today to discuss surrender terms. Your fabricated information about 100 atomic bombs will be presented as intelligence from a captured American pilot. Some in the government may believe it. Some may use it as justification for positions they already hold. Either way, Lieutenant, your lies may help end this war. He returned to his desk, made a notation on the papers before him, then looked up at Marcus with an expression that might have been respect. "I'm going to report that you know nothing of value. You'll be transferred to Omori prisoner of war camp to await the war's end. If Japan surrenders, you'll be liberated. If the war continues, your survival depends on factors beyond your control, but at least you won't be tortured for information you don't possess." They took him to Omori camp that afternoon, a facility on Tokyo Bay that held American prisoners awaiting execution or exchange, depending on how the war ended. The camp was overcrowded, the food inadequate, the sanitation primitive. But it was better than Kempeitai torture cells, and the other prisoners confirmed what Marcus had already suspected. Japan was finished. The atomic bomb had shattered whatever remained of Japanese will to resist. The emperor himself was considering surrender, something unthinkable in Japanese culture, where defeat meant dishonor worse than death. Rumors circulated among the prisoners. A second atomic bomb had struck Nagasaki on August 9th, the day after Marcus's capture. 3 days after Hiroshima, 2 cities destroyed, and now whispers suggested more attacks were coming. The Japanese government was meeting in emergency sessions. The military wanted to fight on, prepared to sacrifice every citizen in defense of the home islands. The civilians wanted surrender, wanted to save what remained of Japan before American bombs erased their entire civilization. On August 10th, the emperor made his decision. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms. Unconditional surrender, but with one condition: the emperor must remain. The Americans debated. President Truman consulted his advisors. The decision hung in the balance, and in Omori camp, American prisoners waited to learn whether they would be liberated or executed as revenge for Japan's defeat. August 15th, 1945, 12 noon. The emperor's voice came over radio broadcasts throughout Japan, announcing surrender in formal language most Japanese could barely understand. But they understood enough. The war was over. Japan had lost. In Omori camp, the guards simply walked away. They unlocked no gates, released no prisoners, made no announcements. They just left, abandoning their posts, because what was the point of guarding prisoners when the war had ended and their entire world had collapsed? The prisoners waited another 4 days before liberation came officially. The 4th Marine Regiment arrived on August 19th, 19 days after Marcus's capture, liberating Omori and several other camps around Tokyo. Marines who'd fought across the Pacific, who'd taken islands at horrific cost, who'd expected to invade Japan's home islands in an operation that would have killed millions. Now they were liberators instead of invaders, and the prisoners they released were evidence that surrender had saved American lives. Marcus walked out of Omori weighing 30 pounds less than when he'd been shot down. His ribs had healed wrong from the kicks he'd received. His thigh bore a scar from the bamboo spear. His hands shook sometimes, after effects of the fear he'd carried for 19 days, wondering if each day would be his last. But he was alive. He'd survived a mob of 300 villagers, survived Kempeitai interrogation, survived imprisonment in Tokyo while the government debated surrender. He'd survived through intelligence, through quick thinking, through a fabricated story about atomic bombs that might have influenced Japan's decision to surrender. Later, much later, historians would debate the role of individual prisoners in Japan's surrender. The Supreme War Council's deliberations on August 9th included discussion of captured American pilot testimony about 100 atomic bombs. War Minister General Korochika Enamai had cited this intelligence during the meeting, using it to argue that further resistance was futile because America possessed enough atomic weapons to destroy every Japanese city. The cabinet had been divided, split between militarists who wanted to fight to the death and pragmatists who recognized that Japan could not win. The emperor had broken the deadlock, choosing surrender, choosing to preserve what remained of Japan rather than sacrifice everything for honor that meant nothing to the dead. Marcus's fabricated testimony had been one data point among many. The atomic bombings themselves, the Soviet declaration of war on August 8th, the complete destruction of Japanese military capacity, the blockade that was starving the home islands, all these factors had contributed to surrender. No single piece of intelligence had determined the outcome. But Marcus's lie had entered the decision-making process at the highest levels, had been cited in meetings that decided the fate of millions, had potentially influenced the calculations that ended the war. The irony was profound. Marcus had fabricated his story to save his own life, not to influence strategic policy. He'd known nothing about atomic bombs, nothing about nuclear physics, nothing about the Manhattan Project's actual capabilities. He'd simply told his captors what they wanted to hear, using half-remembered high school chemistry to construct a plausible-sounding explanation for a weapon he didn't understand. And that lie, that desperate improvisation, had become intelligence brief to the Japanese Supreme War Council. Years later, intelligence analysts would examine this case as evidence of torture's ineffectiveness. Under threat of execution, Marcus had provided detailed testimony about American atomic weapons capabilities. Every word had been false, yet his captors had believed him because they wanted to believe, because belief served their psychological needs better than skepticism. The information had traveled up the chain of command, had been included in briefings, had been cited in meetings, all without anyone verifying its accuracy. This was what torture produced. Not truth, but whatever the victim thought his captors wanted to hear. Marcus returned to America in September 1945, processed through military hospitals that treated his physical injuries and ignored his psychological ones. Post-traumatic stress disorder hadn't been named yet. Combat fatigue, shell shock, these were the terms they used, and they applied primarily to frontline troops, not to pilots who'd spent 19 days as prisoners. He was expected to be fine, expected to return to normal life, expected to forget the mob of 300 villagers who'd wanted him dead, the Kempeitai interrogators who'd threatened to behead him, the cells in Tokyo where other prisoners had screamed in the night. He tried to forget. He went back to Florida, married his sweetheart, started a family, worked civilian jobs that had nothing to do with flying or fighting. He never spoke publicly about his capture, never discussed his fabricated testimony, never claimed credit for influencing Japan's surrender. It was classified anyway, sealed in military intelligence files that wouldn't be declassified until 1907, more than 30 years after the war ended. When the files finally opened, historians discovered Marcus's story buried in thousands of pages of prisoner interrogation transcripts. The intelligence community studied it as a case study in the unreliability of torture-obtained information. Military analysts examined it as an example of how false intelligence propagates through command structures. Psychologists analyzed it as evidence of human ingenuity under extreme stress. But for Marcus, it remained simply what he'd always known it was: a lie told to survive. Nothing more, nothing less. He died in 1998 at age 76, having outlived most of his wartime comrades, having built a life in the peace his generation had fought to achieve. His obituary mentioned his military service, but not his capture, not his fabricated testimony, not his role in potentially influencing Japan's surrender decision. That story remained known only to historians and researchers, buried in academic papers and declassified documents that most Americans would never read. The village where he'd been captured no longer exists in its 1945 form. Post-war development transformed rural Osaka into suburbs and industrial parks. The rice paddies where Marcus landed have been paved over. The wooden post where they'd tied him has long since rotted away. The villagers who'd wanted him dead have themselves died, taking their war memories with them. Nothing physical remains to mark the spot where 300 civilians with bamboo spears and torches surrounded an American pilot on August 8, 1945. But the historical record preserves what happened there, preserves the testimony Marcus gave, preserves the evidence that false information obtained through coercion can influence strategic decisions at the highest levels of government. Intelligence services worldwide study this case, use it in training, cite it as evidence that torture produces unreliable intelligence. The Kempeitai's methods had been brutal, their threats credible, their willingness to kill unquestionable. Yet everything Marcus told them was fiction, fabricated from fragments of remembered education and desperation. And that fiction had traveled from an interrogation room in Osaka to the Supreme War Council in Tokyo, had been cited in discussions of whether Japan should surrender, had become part of the intelligence picture that influenced one of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. The Supreme War Council meeting on August 9, 1945, lasted hours. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, War Minister General Korochika Anami, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and military chiefs of staff debated Japan's options. The military wanted to continue fighting, wanted to inflict such horrific casualties on invading American forces that the United States would accept a negotiated peace that preserved Japan's sovereignty and honor. The civilians wanted immediate surrender, wanted to save what remained of Japan's cities, wanted to preserve the emperor and the Japanese people, even at the cost of unconditional surrender. General Anami presented intelligence from multiple sources: Soviet entry into the war, American naval bombardment of coastal cities, conventional bombing continuing despite the atomic attacks, and testimony from a captured American pilot who claimed the United States possessed 100 atomic bombs, with Tokyo and Kyoto as next targets. The cabinet listened. Some believed the pilot's testimony, others questioned it. But even those who doubted the specific numbers understood the broader implication. America possessed atomic weapons, had demonstrated willingness to use them, and could produce more. Whether the actual number was 10 or 100 mattered less than the fundamental reality. Japan could not defend against this weapon, could not prevent its use, could not survive if America chose to atomic bomb every major city. Emperor Hirohito made his decision based on this totality of evidence, not on Marcus's false testimony alone, but on everything collectively. The atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the complete loss of military options, the certainty that continued resistance meant national extinction. He chose survival over honor, chose to preserve the Japanese people even at the cost of surrender's shame. His radio address on August 15th used formal classical Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand, but they grasped the essential message. The war was over. Japan had lost. The unthinkable had happened. In homes and military bases and factories throughout Japan, people wept. Some from relief that the bombing would end, others from shame that Japan had surrendered. Still others from grief for the dead, for the cities destroyed, for the future that had been incinerated along with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Marcus's fabricated testimony about 100 atomic bombs had been one factor among many, not the determining factor, not the sole cause of surrender, but part of the intelligence picture that informed Japan's decision. In the chaos of war's end, as occupation forces arrived and Japanese military forces disbanded and millions of displaced people tried to return home, nobody tracked down the American pilot whose false testimony had been cited in Supreme War Council meetings. Marcus was simply one of thousands of liberated prisoners, processed through military channels, debriefed by intelligence officers, sent home to resume civilian life. The debrief was routine: name, rank, serial number, date and location of capture, treatment received, intelligence observed. Marcus answered honestly about his capture, described the mob that had nearly killed him, explained the Kempeitai interrogation. When asked what intelligence he'd provided to his captors, he told the truth. Nothing accurate. Everything he'd said about atomic bombs had been fabricated, inventions based on high school chemistry and desperation. The intelligence officer made notes, filed the report, moved on to the next debriefing. Thousands of prisoners required processing. Marcus's case wasn't unique or particularly noteworthy from an administrative perspective. Just another American pilot shot down, captured, interrogated, liberated. The routine nature of his debriefing was itself remarkable. He'd fabricated testimony that reached the Supreme War Council, potentially influenced surrender deliberations, and become a case study in interrogation unreliability. Yet to the debriefing officer, it was simply another report to file, another prisoner processed through the system. This disconnect between individual experience and bureaucratic procedure characterized the war's end. Millions of personal stories, each unique and significant to the people who lived them, reduced to forms and files and statistics. Marcus had survived an extraordinary ordeal through quick thinking and fabrication. The military recorded it as routine capture and interrogation. The gap between lived experience and official record would persist until historians decades later excavated the files and reconstructed what had actually happened. The 50 American prisoners executed in Osaka after Japan's surrender announcement would never get to tell their stories. They'd been held at the facility where Marcus would have remained if the Kempeitai hadn't transferred him to Tokyo for further interrogation. His fabricated testimony had made him valuable enough to move, had saved his life by convincing his captors he possessed intelligence worth preserving. Those 50 men had been deemed less valuable, expendable, targets for revenge execution by guards and soldiers who saw surrender as personal dishonor. They'd been shot, bayoneted, beheaded in the hours after the emperor's radio address, killed by men who couldn't accept defeat and took their rage out on helpless prisoners. Marcus would learn about these executions during his debriefing. He'd realize that his lie had saved him not just from the interrogation's torture, but from the post-surrender massacre. Random chance, timing, the decision to move him to Tokyo all had combined to place him somewhere else when the killings started. Survivor's guilt would follow him for years. Why had he lived when 50 others died? What made him special? Nothing except the specific sequence of events that had moved him from Osaka to Tokyo at precisely the right moment. The broader question of whether his false testimony influenced Japan's surrender would remain unanswerable. Historical causation is complex, overdetermined, impossible to reduce to single factors. Japan surrendered because of atomic bombs, Soviet intervention, military defeat, economic collapse, blockade, conventional bombing, diplomatic isolation, emperor intervention, and dozens of other factors that accumulated into inevitable conclusion. Marcus's fabricated testimony was one data point in that accumulation. It was cited in Supreme War Council meetings. It was included in intelligence briefings. It contributed to Japanese perceptions of American atomic capabilities. But it wasn't determinative, wasn't the factor that tipped the balance, wasn't the reason Japan surrendered. Yet it also wasn't irrelevant. Intelligence informs decisions even when it's false. The Japanese government's belief that America possessed 100 atomic bombs influenced their calculations, even though the actual number in August 1945 was 0 ready weapons, with a third bomb possible by late August and a fourth by September. Marcus's lie had exaggerated American capabilities by a factor of 100, had made Japan's position seem even more hopeless than it actually was, had contributed to perceptions that further resistance was futile. In this sense, his fabrication might have accelerated Japan's surrender decision, might have saved lives by shortening the war even by days, might have prevented further atomic bombings, or the planned invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945. Or it might have changed nothing. The atomic bombs demonstrated power, the Soviet invasion, the emperor's intervention. These factors might have been sufficient, regardless of prisoner testimony. Historical causation resists definitive answers. Multiple factors interact in ways that make isolating individual contributions impossible. What remains beyond dispute is the human story. Marcus McDilda, 24 years old, shot down over Japan, surrounded by 300 villagers with bamboo spears, threatened with execution, fabricated a story that reached the highest levels of Japanese government. He survived through intelligence, quick thinking, and a half-remembered chemistry education that let him construct a plausible-sounding lie under conditions of extreme stress. He walked out of Omori camp on August 19, 1945, having spent 19 days as a prisoner during the most consequential period of the 20th century. He returned to America, built a normal life, and carried his memories privately until his death in 1998. His story entered the historical record only when classified files were declassified in 1907, more than 3 decades after the events. Historians discovered it, analyzed it, used it to understand interrogation practices, intelligence reliability, and the end of World War II. Intelligence agencies studied it as a case study in why torture produces unreliable information. Military analysts examined it as an example of how false intelligence propagates through command structures. The village where Marcus was captured transformed from rural agriculture to urban development. The rice paddies became parking lots. The wooden buildings became concrete apartments. The people who'd wanted him dead were replaced by new generations with no memory of the war, no connection to the rage that had driven 300 villagers to hunt an American pilot with improvised weapons. Japan itself transformed from military empire to peaceful democracy, from enemy to ally, from antagonist to economic partner. The generation that fought the war died off, taking their first-hand memories with them, leaving only historical records and fading photographs. Marcus's P-51 Mustang remained scattered across a hillside southeast of Osaka, pieces of aluminum and steel gradually rusting into the earth, becoming part of the landscape. Nobody marked the crash site. Nobody preserved the wreckage. The war had produced too many wrecks, too much destruction to memorialize individual aircraft. It simply disappeared, swallowed by time and development in the desire to forget. But the story persisted, not as public memory, not as commemorated history, but as classified documents that eventually became historical sources. The Kempeitai interrogation transcripts, the Supreme War Council meeting minutes, the prisoner debriefing reports, all preserved in archives where researchers decades later could reconstruct what happened. They found Marcus's fabricated testimony about atomic bombs. They found evidence it had been cited in high-level meetings. They found the physicist's report stating the testimony was false. They assembled these fragments into a narrative that revealed how false intelligence obtained through torture infiltrated strategic decision-making during the war's final days. The implications extended beyond World War II. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies debated interrogation ethics and effectiveness. Marcus's case became evidence that torture produces unreliable information, that desperate prisoners will say anything to stop pain, that fabricated testimony can sound plausible enough to fool even sophisticated analysts. The debate continued into the 21st century when new conflicts raised old questions about interrogation methods. Marcus's story was cited in congressional testimony, in academic papers, in military training, always as evidence that torture doesn't work, that the information it produces is unreliable, that there are better methods for obtaining accurate intelligence. General David Petraeus, commanding U.S. Central Command in 2007, stated explicitly, "History shows that torture is frequently neither useful nor necessary." Marcus McDilda's case was part of that history, part of the evidence that supported this conclusion. A desperate lie told to avoid execution had become historical proof that coercion produces unreliable intelligence. The irony would have amused Marcus if he'd lived to see his story used this way. He hadn't been making a statement about interrogation ethics. He'd been trying to survive. The fact that his survival strategy later became evidence in policy debates about torture was accidental, a byproduct of historical preservation and later analysis. The essential truth remains simple. Faced with death, he'd lied convincingly enough to live. Everything else, the intelligence implications, the potential influence on surrender decisions, the historical significance, all came later, imposed by analysts and historians seeking meaning in events. For Marcus, it had been immediate and personal. Stay alive, get through today, survive to see tomorrow. The most fundamental human drive, pursued through intelligence and improvisation when violence couldn't save him. The 300 villagers with bamboo spears and torches remain nameless in the historical record. No one recorded their identities, documented their motivations, or preserved their perspectives. They existed in Marcus's memory and in the general historical record of Japanese civilian attitudes toward captured American airmen. But as individuals, they vanished into historical anonymity. Their village was real. Their rage was real. Their desire for revenge against the pilot whose countrymen had burned their cities was comprehensible, if not justifiable. But history preserved the victim's story while the attackers remained faceless. Their motivations understood in general terms, but their individual stories lost. This asymmetry characterized war history generally. Winners write the history, survivors tell the story.